If we think about media on the internet, it does many of those things, right? The fan communities I've spent much of my career studying write stories not because they want to get in the industry or they want to make money, but because they love telling stories and they want to tell stories to each other.
That's what we're doing when we play music, when we're playing this folk music. We're telling stories. Stories that speak to the human condition, stories that speak to who we are as people. Stories that teach us how to live and teach us how to learn and teach us how to cope. Stories about nature and friendship and relationships. Stories that are riddled with anecdotes of love in all its complexities and simplicities. They're about stories between family members. They're about stories about your community, love for your community and your country and your world. These stories speak to us as people, anywhere and everywhere, for everyone and no one. These songs are our songs. We tell these stories to each other all the time. Whether we know it or not, we see them every day. We look somebody in the eye and there's a story behind that person. But do we listen? Are we trying to find those stories?
Around a year ago, I recorded a video essay about Vector to the Heavens, a music track from one of the Kingdom Hearts games, 358 Days Over Chu. Ever since I first heard it, Vector has been a very dear composition to me. But that's not only because of the original track composed by Yoko Shimomura. No, what made this track really special were all of the different fan-made interpretations that started to appear. I don't think it's weird to imagine that when a song is popular, it's bound to have covers made of it, each of those covers displaying their own unique additions or changes to it, and of course, that happened here. But that's where it got truly interesting. Certain arrangements, covers, and interpretations of the track had elements that stood out so much that they started popping up in other covers of Vector. Entire fan-made arrangements started borrowing creative decisions directly from each other, or developing from where another might have left off, to the point where they started converging unintentionally and bleeding into the collective consciousness of what the piece is. Stories were unknowingly being created, and music was their medium. I want to find these stories. I know how much this piece mattered to my musical upbringing, and that's my story. But everyone who's contributed to it throughout all of these years is a piece of that too. Many people were expressing a story that impacted them through their own interpretation of its music. When we look at some of the vocal covers of Shion's theme with fan-made lyrics, they express Shion's story, and several instrumental versions of Shion's theme incorporate some form of storytelling through sound. Every individual change and every specific element that was taken from one person and used by someone else, that's all part of one big story, one big folk culture that consists of musical connections. I went very in-depth about most of these connections in my From Dirge to Vector video, in which I explained the history of both fan-made and official arrangements of Vector to the Heavens and Shion's theme. I highly recommend you go watch that if you want to get the full picture about the subject. If you don't, however, I created this interactive map of all of the connections between fan arrangements, and you can check it out by clicking the link in the description. Although there's probably more I could add to it, it gives us more than enough data to work with. You can click on the title of any video inside the chart and be taken to a page where you can listen to it, see where it stands in the connection map, and read a brief description of what elements it may have in common with other covers. Don't worry though, I'll be going over some of the examples during this video as well. With that in mind, although there are countless covers of this piece out there, to trace the folk process within it, it's necessary to cut them down to only specific versions that do directly tie to one another. I believe every cover of this theme is technically part of these connections, even if indirectly, because they're telling their stories and it all comes down to the single track. However, I'd like to focus on proving the influence they have within each other by showing these networks in a comprehensive visual manner. There are many iconic fan covers that are missing from this map. The reason being that I couldn't really trace any elements from them that were undeniably used by other people or vice versa. In my previous video essay, I included some speculation about cases like these, but since I don't have real evidence to back up their links to the folk process, I won't include any of those this time. Anyway, that was really only the beginning. There's still a lot to talk about when it comes to this entire phenomenon. This is a very niche topic about an even more specific situation. You're probably thinking, Keynote, why the hell do you care so specifically about all of this? And I'm not really sure how to answer that, besides the fact that observing all these different versions of Xian's theme being performed as I grew up, hearing people's different takes and executions of it, and wanting to be a part of that, was a huge part of why I fell in love with music, and why I began studying it. I've also completely lost control of what my hyperfixations are, but that's kind of besides the point. The point of this research specifically is to trace the connections in covers of Xian's theme and see what we can learn from them. So where do we go from here? What else could I possibly have to talk about when it comes to Vector to the Heavens and its derivative versions? The truth is, after I posted that video, I started working on turning some of the things I'd been uncovering into an actual academic research for my university, and I started falling into a rabbit hole of interesting discoveries that helped me begin to understand and explain some uncertainties I had, but also raised a couple of questions. What exactly happened there? Is this a common occurrence with video game music or music in general? Is there something to be learned from observing all of this? And finally, is Xian's theme actually folk music? Well, kind of. But before we can answer any of that, there are some things that I think are very important to consider when talking about influences and connections that may arise in fan spaces, as well as media and other artistic expressions such as music. So let's get onto that. We can't begin to talk about fan spaces without bringing up Henry Jenkins, probably the most renowned researcher about the subject. Don't worry if you don't know about him, I didn't either before doing any of this research. All you need to know about him right now is that the most important concept that we can take from Jenkins that applies to the situation is that of a participatory culture. That is, a culture in which individuals do not only act as consumers of a piece of media, but also as contributors and producers.
Participatory culture describes a world where everyone participates, that where we take media in our own hands, where we have the capacity often to produce media, share media. I trace participatory culture back to the middle of the 19th century. High school age kids were producing publications, hand-laying type down, and sending them across a national network. So the Amateur Press Association in the 19th century paved the way for science fiction fandom, amateur radio and ham radio, the zine movements around Riot Girls and punk rock, the indie movement around Seattle and the World Trade Organization, down to the rise of digital media.
In this context, think of how the internet allows for the creation and sharing of art and content in general. Think of how in fandom spaces art derived from a piece of media is a very common practice, be it that in the form of fan art, fanfiction, music covers, mock-ups, conventions and real-life events where fans meet up, or even digital fandom spaces like discussion forums. All of these count as examples of a participatory culture. This results in communities, subcultures, and spaces where fans of specific media forge their own ways of interacting with it together through their own creative productions. When it comes to Vector's fan covers, I think the concept of a participatory culture is absolutely necessary to consider, but it doesn't explain the whole phenomenon by itself. At the start, when all of these covers of Vector were coming out, they seemed coincidentally linked. This wasn't a specific community of musicians or Kingdom Hearts fans deciding to make these covers connected, nor did anyone even notice such relations at the time. It wasn't a deliberate effort, and while they shared musical connections, the social aspect of a participatory culture was kind of lacking. However, the very fact that they were somehow influencing each other, and that this was only possible due to their connections to a singular piece of media, that being Kingdom Hearts, makes it pretty clear that this is in some form related to how we understand participatory culture, even if it's not exactly by the books. A publication by Mirko Tobias Schaefer presents a very useful critical framework for participatory culture, a separation into both implicit and explicit forms of participation. To try to keep it simple, Schaefer describes explicit participation as driven by the intent to contribute to a cultural context. A good example of this would be direct file sharing, contributing to wikis, or engaging in fan spaces and fan culture directly. Nowadays, I think that being active in fandom communities as a content creator on platforms such as Twitter, Tumblr, Reddit, or even apps like TikTok, which are tailor-made to allow for bubbles and communities to interact in semi-isolation, absolutely counts in this understanding. Take Noah Theis, for example. His cover of Vector to the Heavens became extremely influential, and it wasn't super present in fandom spaces, nor was he ever necessarily much involved with them. It just happened to become an emblematic representation of the piece because it was the very first arrangement to contain tutorials and free sheet music available from the get-go. His intent was to offer tools for people to learn how to play Vector to the Heavens at a time where no one had shared sheet music or tutorials for the song yet. It was very much directed at the community, therefore it was the easiest version of the song to learn how to play. It had cultural intent, so it's an example of explicit participatory culture. I tried to include on the map as many derivative versions of this piece as possible, but I avoided those that sounded too similar to Noah's. The biggest testament to how widespread his version got is the sheer huge amount of identical covers of it. This definitely contributed in the sense that it spread the version, and many of these performances even included slight differences, but I wanted to focus on the most transformative iterations, so I showed some of them off in the previous video. Just know that there are a lot more covers than the ones you see on this map. It'd take a while to showcase them all, but there's very specific stylistic elements to Noah's version, as well as structural and phrasal differences, so it's super easy to catch on other covers if you're paying attention.
If we think about YouTube, many of the people on YouTube are producing media because there's something they vitally want to share. It might be an amateur remix artist who saw a TV show they loved and set it to music. They acquired their skill by simply playing around with media. All of that becomes part of what I'm describing as a participatory culture.
Schaefer understands that sometimes this process of participation is implicit or unintentional. He argues that when it comes to implicit participation, the actor is not necessarily aware of a conscious collective activity of cultural production. They might not be involved in a deliberate collaboration or necessarily in intentional contact with others. It's much more about interacting with content rather than creating it. In my previous video, I not only talked about how covers of this theme interacted with each other, but also how they might have borrowed elements from official arrangements of the piece as well, such as the piano collections and memoria arrangements. Ironically, despite them being official, I believe they fall closer to the concept of implicit participation. While I do think these official arrangements are still important context, I don't consider them intentionally part of the participative culture when it comes to this piece. They do not and cannot even unintentionally acknowledge the community's involvement in the recreation of the piece, because these official arrangements did not emerge within fan communities, so in my opinion, they don't continue the folk process in the same way, although they might indirectly affect it. It's a sort of outside force that is self-removed from the continuous and complex lineage of self-published interpretations usually posted by fans, so any relation they might have to them would be entirely one-sided. They're not part of the chain. As much as we can apply the concepts surrounding participatory culture with situations regarding covers of video game music, they will not always accurately describe this particular sort of instance of media intersecting with musical engagement and fan culture. So it's important to utilize the aspects that do work about participatory culture while exploring contexts that specifically address the convergence of music, sound, and other media. We can call these larger cultural contexts sonic participatory cultures. To fully understand why and how covers of Xian's theme interact, we'll need to go over several concepts. A lot of academic works about video game music tackle the subject of interacting with sound in, through, or with video games. Each of those is a different kind of sonic participation. Think of rhythm games such as Guitar Hero, Just Dance, or now, in the Kingdom Hearts series, Melody of Memory. Many games allow for the actual creation of music or interaction with music through tools inside it. And of course, it's possible for people to create music sampling resources and sounds from video games as well. But rarely does anyone address the sort of situation we find ourselves in now, cases where music is created around a video game soundtrack, and because of it. Enter the concept of sonic paratexts. Sonic creations or music that exists in relation to other sonic creations. For example, an arrangement of an existing song is a sonic paratext because it exists in relation to its original piece. The performance of video game music, whether in physical or digital spaces, is also considered a form of sonic participation around video games, often serving to relay information from other works and other sonic paratexts. Obviously, in regard to the vector scenario, we can consider that all of these arrangements fit that description, since they're all connected to the original and to each other. These sonic paratexts often decontextualize video game music, in the sense that they are presenting music created for and from video games, but removed from their original context, as well as serve to connect the concept of folk music and the folk process to video game music, in the sense that they can relay information, lore, and creativity around players while also developing a sense of unity. The most popular example of this that is talked about in academia is the concept of folk music, a variation of folk music themed around sci-fi and fantasy media, and usually sung and shared around conventions and early fandom spaces. Folk music is mostly related to lyrical parodies and is a much more rare practice in the current days. So we'll be getting back to it a bit later, but I thought it'd be good to mention it now, seeing as it has links to both video game music and folk music in academia. You might still be wondering what folk music even has to do with Vector Should Happens at all, but it's about to make a whole lot of sense. To be clear, I'm not necessarily talking about folk as a genre, but folk as a process. The folk process in music can be described as being the tendency of melodies and lyrics to change to varying degrees, as they are passed from person to person or generation to generation. It occurs when people execute a piece that they remember differently from the way they originally heard it, or if the piece is modified for another reason. Generally, one would think that it refers specifically to folk music as a genre, but the folk process is a phenomenon that is present not only in other genres of music, but also in other mediums: art, fashion, oral tales, myths, cultural traditions, and many others. Henry Jenkins explains that in participatory cultures, aspects of folk culture are also present.
Communities began to produce media to share ideas among themselves, and where they follow some of the practices we might associate with a folk culture. In a folk culture, media is produced not to make money. People produce media to share it with each other. When someone makes a quilt, as my grandmother used to make, people gather together. There's no expert. People are learning from each other. Skills get passed from someone who knows a little more to someone who knows a little less. It's a social mode of production. It's a gift.
In music, the folk process is close to the concept of remixing, the idea of modifying an existing piece. It refers to a network of changes, the modification of existing ideas in a song as it passes through several people.
It's about how cultural artifacts are changed over time and how basically when they change their culture at the same time. I tell you a joke and you laugh at it and you like it, and you take the joke and you decide, okay, I'm going to tell it, and you pass it along. You change, you put your own spin on it. Eventually, maybe it'll come back to me. It's the same joke, it's recognizable, but it's different. And that's, in a nutshell, that's the folk process. We sing songs over periods of time and they change a bit. And it applies to anything that's changeable, stories or any kind of what we might term intellectual property.
A song passed down from generation to generation, like a game of telephone, is bound to undergo changes along the way, because each interpreter will understand the source material a little bit differently, and will leak some of their own style, personality, and tastes into their version, which in turn will be modified again if interpreted by someone else. However, the folk process, as something that is naturally present in every culture in some way, shape, or form, naturally also occurs on the internet in its own way. Of course, there's no way we can categorize the internet as a whole as one single culture. Within the internet, there are countless communities, subcultures, and even micro-societies that all interact with each other within themselves in unique and constantly changing ways. So it's borderline impossible to say that the presence of the folk process is one that will manifest the same way in all of these online spaces.
Lonely, I'm Mr. Lonely. I have nobody for my own. I'm so lonely, I'm Mr. Lonely. I have nobody for my own. I'm so lonely.
Yo, this one here goes out to all my players out there, man. You know, that got that one good girl that's always been there, man. Like, took all the bullshit. Ain't taking no more.
But there is one thing that they should all have in common. That, differently from the traditional understanding of folk process, where the piece will slowly transition from agent to agent and each version is fleeting, temporary, and generally unregistered, music on the internet is more accessible, not only from one person to another, but from one person to entire communities. The online form of folk process, which in real-life spaces would usually rely on circles and communities of people performing music together in the same physical space and time, becomes less private and much more widespread, something that is present without being given much thought. It can happen anywhere and at any time. Anyone on the internet has immediate access to a much wider range of ideas and content. In turn, one individual idea is more likely to quickly reach multiple spectators. This idea of a new folk process enabled by the internet is explored by researcher John Agonies and referred to as remix culture or remix process. Agonies talks about how the remix culture and, by extension, this new folk process gives authorship to the communities that interact with music, and how digital spaces have their own digital cultures, such as those found in fandom spaces, which are communal and therefore amplify the folk process. When he argues that remix culture employs a communal outlook on art, he's essentially saying that, in this new folk process, art has a much more immediate reach into communities. The folk process no longer relies on being passed from one individual to another in the same physical space. This is thanks to what Henry Jenkins calls convergence culture, the idea that new technologies converge and allow for the distribution of media to expand. Now might be a good time to bring up what I call evolutionary lines in the Vector to the Heavens map, or remix lines. These are versions that utilize the actual audio of other covers and either build up on them or take audio samples. Check out how both Becker Ruth and Ascon's versions were modified by someone else, and then see how those modified versions were changed again by third parties. It's fascinating to see just how many different ways the folk process can exist in relation to a single piece of music.
so lost. Will I be able to see the sky again? Oh, please, one more day. Wishing, praying.
The changes observed in these cases seem to mostly be additions rather than variations, but either would fit with our idea of remix. When we say remix culture, we're actually talking about any of the new ways in which the folk process can manifest itself in online spaces, including the ones observed earlier in Noah's version. But even within this remix culture, there seem to be many different ways it can appear, and I'm not sure there's a proper way to categorize them yet. And of course, the abundance of new communication technologies amplifies these expressions of remix and the reach they can have. This new scale and reach enabled by the new technologies may make it so that the networks created by the folk process become much more complex and varied, but it also makes them traceable. With research, it's possible to map out to some extent how the folk process can manifest itself within music online, giving us some much more insight to how the music made by these online communities can alter the general perception of the source material, and how fans interacting with content, whether intentionally or not, can play off of each other's creative processes while doing so. We can observe precisely this sort of new folk process, this remix culture, with how fan-made versions of Vector to the Heavens were embraced and adapted by other musicians. Take for example how Jameo Music's cover utilized very specific elements introduced by Hypochondriac Piano's cover. Elements which, for some reason or another, became so ingrained in how people perceived the piece that they thought it had originated from the in-game version. Hypochondriac's arrangement of the piece, for the most part, is a pretty faithful recreation of Xian's theme, but introduces a new original section at the 1 minute and 50 second mark. This section is very likely some sort of variation on the Kyrie motif present in Xian's theme, but it's different in a very specific way. It doesn't sound like Kyrie's motif anymore. We can hear this element being used in 3 other different arrangements, not including any of the other interpretations of this exact arrangement by other people. Those would be Lily Springer, Jameo Music, and Serge Blitzen. Out of those, Serge Blitzen seems to be the only person who was aware that they were borrowing an element from this specific arrangement, as they point out in their video description. Hypochondriac's arrangement has been performed by many other people online, so maybe that resulted in people simply associating this element with the original piece, not knowing it originated from a fan version. It's a pretty good example of the remix culture at work, affecting the collective understanding of the original track. We've talked plenty about our instrumental arrangements and covers so far, but
I feel like I'm forgetting something really important.
what about vocal covers? Something that is very common to most fandom cultures is music themes around media, a description very familiar to the concept of filk.
Right there,
What?
you have to define filk.
Oh, I'm not an expert, so maybe we should listen to some people who actually know what they're talking about, give their thoughts on it.
The word itself started out as a typo on a science fiction convention flyer in the mid-50s.
Okay,
It was supposed to be folk music.
right.
But the word filk got printed on the flyer and it kind of stuck. Filk is science fiction folk music.
To me, filk is where Star Wars meets Star Trek on a field of musical battle.
It's a wide range of things. Some of it is parodies, it's new words to old music, so you get things like, what do you do with a drunken spaceman?
It's where muggles meet monsters and werewolves meet wizards and vampires meet vixens, where pirates and princesses and planetary explorers all come together in one place to enjoy songs that celebrate the things we appreciate as fans.
And then there's a lot of new music, people that are writing original music related to various science fiction themes.
It's a place, it's an event, it's a community where everyone is welcome, where you can spectate or participate, and where your ability is not really as important as your enthusiasm and your attitude.
It's very eclectic. Some of it is on the folk side of things.
It's a place where the tunes can be original or traditional, where the lyrics can be serious or silly, filled with imagery or innuendo or just about anything else.
And it's all considered filk.
Filk is old and new, sometimes borrowed and sometimes very, very blue. But above all, to me, filk is fun. And as I've told people for a long time, if you're not having fun doing what you're doing, you ought to be doing something else.
When it comes to the vocal covers of Xian's theme, there were two sets of lyrics that became extremely popular. The first is by a user called One Blue Roses 1, of which the original video with the lyrics unfortunately no longer exists, but many video descriptions credit them for the lyrics, and now link to a private video. The second is Liz Robinade's lyrics, which she sang over Ascant's arrangement. Liz's cover not only got remixed by Madison twice, but her lyrics were also utilized in many different covers by other people. The way these lyrics became well known in the fandom and are all about Xian's story or from her perspective is very familiar to the idea of filk. There's a very clear purpose of storytelling, and of course, the fact that a lot of people enjoyed the lyrics and recorded their own covers singing them only strengthens that connection.
Please remember who I used to be. Who am I? I'm a puppet in their game.
We even had the case of Nate Wants to Battle writing a very popular original Kingdom Hearts themed song, and borrowing Liz's lyrics for a section of it. This is totally on brand with the concept of filk.
Remember, remember, please remember who I used to be. Who am I? Who am I? I'm a puppet in their game.
Filk is all about communities, storytelling, and expressing excitement over things we care about. It's about groups of people joining together to have a good time, singing about something they love. But just as the folk process exists differently online, so does filk. And all of these concepts we explored, participatory cultures, sonic paratexts, performance around video game music, the folk process, remix cultures, and filk, they all come together to shape the connections in derivative versions of Xian's themes. These ideas all intersect in this one case study.
In almost every case, what we heard with young people had a richer intellectual and creative life outside of school than inside it. The things they learned from, the things they cared about, were things they did after the school day was over. I mean, I'm deeply enthusiastic about all of the stuff that's taking place outside of school. But if we leave it there as sort of, we create feral children of the internet, you know, and the idea that just let them be, they'll learn on their own, I think leaves a lot of kids behind. And it leaves us, those kids, without adult guidance, without engagement and skill, validation of those skills that would prepare them to move up to higher levels and to get recognition for what they've accomplished. They don't need us snooping over their shoulders, but they do need us watching their backs. In the short term, it's about getting this stuff in the hands of teachers who will want to make a difference and giving them the validation and encouragement they need to keep fighting the good fight on behalf of the new media literacies.
If it weren't for my interest in this one piece of music all those years ago, I can confidently say that my life would be entirely different. I think everyone has something like this. So many people, especially children, begin developing skills with incredible enthusiasm because they're interested in interacting with media they love, and usually interested in creating their own art in relation to it. The cultural potential of fan culture is unlimited, but it's also good to remember that people find their own ways to learn how to write, how to edit, how to make music, how to draw. All of these learning experiences fueled not only by media, but by the community surrounding media. Fandom is a valid educational tool, one that should be encouraged rather than sometimes shamed or overlooked. There needs to be more value given to these sorts of things. I agree with Jenkins fully when he says that providing some sort of guidance, but not censorship, for kids developing skills in fandom could probably amplify and maximize students' learning potentials. Give them a sense of belonging, of cultural importance, of love for their craft. No grades, no pressure. I think we've got to give kids their wings and let them fly. That's how they can learn to their fullest potential. Let their identities shine in self-found communities. So, is Xi'an's theme folk music? Yeah, pretty much. What happened with covers of this theme is undeniably an example of folk culture. This is how the folk process manifests itself in online fandom spaces, and when all of these different concepts interact together. This process in this form may be a result of very specific sonic paratexts being intertwined in a participatory culture. But just like folk, it's a new expression of folk that doesn't fit into one single box. It's not just folk, it's both the remix process and participatory cultures happening around video game music and online spaces. It's a story that was just waiting to be found, waiting to be told, and now I've told it. Whatever you were expecting from this video, it probably wasn't this, but you stuck around to the end, so I gotta give you my props. If you enjoyed this video and this research, I'd immensely appreciate your support. A little sub goes along the way, you know, and I'd like to. But I also love to read just your comments and pick up all your little brains apart, you know? So let me know if there's anything in particular in this video that caught your attention. With all that said, I think it's time to finish up. So I will see you in the next one.